Welcome to The Honest Media. I am Tom Pappert, your host, and today is April 20th, 2017. In this week's episode, I'll be joined again by Dan Lyman of Infowars.com. He is their foreign correspondent currently in Iceland. Before we do that, I want to tell you what we're going to be talking about. We've got a lot of stuff happening both here locally in the United States and abroad in Europe. In the next few segments, we're going to be joined by Craig Chrysler. He'll tell us what's going on, or we'll discuss rather what's going on in Berkeley, in California, across the nation, in Cleveland. And before we do that, I want to get with Dan Lyman, and he's going to tell us again what's going on in Europe. Specifically, Dan, what's going on with Le Pen, and how are you today?
I'm doing very well, Tom. Thanks. Good to hear from you. What's going on with Le Pen? I think that's anyone's best guess. I don't think anyone knows. Even the mainstream media does not even profess to know. They are definitely hoping that Le Pen is not successful. But at the moment, according to the polls, she's neck and neck with Macron, which is basically the globalist candidate. And then we have kind of the establishment conservative candidate. You might want to compare him to like a Marco Rubio type, François Fillon. He's just hot on their tails. And they also have basically a red communist that has come out of nowhere. He's like apparently more hard left than Bernie Sanders, and they tout him as the next Hugo Chavez. Obviously not a good thing, but he's polling very well at the moment as well. So it's like a 22-22, 2019 kind of a race right now, but also about 1/3 of the French voting populace is still undecided.
And of course, with the Trump campaign, we saw the use of these polls, and we learned that, at least in the United States, I haven't done the research to know if France suffers from the same, we'll just say, dishonesty, but you know, they could very easily be manipulating these numbers. So you had a piece in Infowars.com earlier this week, I believe on the 18th, that is Marine Le Pen promising to bring in an immigration moratorium on immigrants coming to France. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it seems like Le Pen is definitely sharpening her rhetoric as we enter the home stretch here. I think that one of the the main concerns in elections across the West, but certainly in France, is immigration and national security. And at this point, Le Pen has taken things even a step further, and she said that she would consider a temporary freeze on all immigration, period, legal and otherwise, until they can get things sorted out. So she did propose that at a rally earlier this week, and that made some big news.
And of course, they make her sound like she is literally Hitler for doing something like this. I'll just read a little bit of her statement that you quoted in your article up on Infowars. "I would decide on a moratorium on all legal immigration to stop this frenzy, this uncontrolled situation that is dragging us down." And she continued, "I will protect you. My first measure as president will be to reinstate France's borders. Behind mass immigration, there is terror. Give us France back. I have heard this appeal everywhere I have been." And of course, across the globe, we see this marriage between Islam and the left that makes no sense to many. And when you get a strong, powerful woman telling the world to examine these problems, to think twice before welcoming these people into your home, she's a bigot, she's a racist, she wants to kill Middle Easterners, whatever. Can you tell us what's going on in terms of the protests against Le Pen?
Well, yeah, I just did a piece. Should be out a little bit later today. Last night, she had I guess it was her final rally, you could say, before the first round of elections, which is on Sunday, and Antifa was out in full force. They were, deploying explosives, clashing with riot police, doing the stuff that they've become so famous for doing. They're basically, terrorists, and they were out last night, a few hundred of them, wreaking havoc in Marseille. A few days ago, there was also a terrorist attack that was thwarted by anti-terrorism police in Marseille, and it was a couple of ISIS, either sympathizers or soldiers. That they're all kind of a global network at this point. It's hard to pinpoint whether or not they've been in battle or they were radicalized on the internet. We don't know, but they were planning on assassinating a presidential candidate, and they were planning that in Marseille. Just 2 or 3 days ago, they were busted by the French police. I believe that the French media tried to say that they were making an attempt on Fillon, but I'm not for sure on that. But it seems a strange coincidence given that Le Pen was to be in town just 2 days later.
Well, and of course, you bring that up. I did see one European news source, I won't give out the name because I don't want people to read them, that actually blamed Le Pen for the thwarted terrorist attack, saying without her rhetoric, this never would have happened. I want to ask you, because to me there are some striking similarities between what's happening in France and what just got done happening last November here in the United States. Can you draw some comparisons between Le Pen and Trump, both in terms of the outrage and what they're saying?
Well, sure. These are both nationalist candidates in general. There's a lot of similarities between the two. A lot of talk of closing the borders, of cracking down on immigration, refugee crisis stuff, and having to deal with the influx of Islamists to both countries. The French Islamic population is, I believe, the highest in Europe now, somewhere around 10 or 11%, and that's being reflected in the terrorist attacks that are taking place fairly regularly now in France. And just like I said, one thwarted a couple of days ago, but you have situations all the time, like in Paris, things that go kind of under the radar, but people getting stabbed. I mean, there was a woman that was just stabbed there a few days ago, last week, in Paris. Just incidents that don't necessarily even make the news because they're not massive, mass killings, but they're facing a huge problem in France, and that the globalist media is doing everything in their power to paint Le Pen as the racist, bigot, Islamophobic candidate, just as they did with Trump in the United States. But when you look at the polls, where they polled the French people and also the Americans, in terms of how they feel about just rampant immigration, just unbridled, refugees, asylum seekers, open borders, people are not in support of this. This is not a radical idea to favor national borders and national security. So that this is, the mainstream media at this point, they are the radicals. They're definitely pushing an agenda that is not supported by the majority of the populace. And I think it's time that people wake up to that fact that they are the ones pushing the radical agenda, and the rest of us are just simply trying to live safe and comfortable lives.
Absolutely. We've got to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to ask you, we had John Kerry last year say we just wouldn't have these terrorist attacks if the media would stop talking about them. We will be right back. You're watching The Honest Media. I'm Tom Pappert here with Dan Lyman. Welcome back to The Honest Media. I'm Tom Pappert here with Dan Lyman. We're currently discussing Marine Le Pen, French presidential candidate, the first round of elections in France. They have two rounds back to back. The first is coming up Sunday, I believe. The second one will be next in May. And, we in the last segment, Dan, we were talking about the fact that a lot of these terrorist attacks don't get publicized anymore, which is a shame because people need to know what's going on around them. In your article that's up on Infowars.com about Le Pen, it says, 60% of French people recently said they do not feel safe in the country anywhere. Not in the no-go zone, not in the countryside. They feel safe nowhere in their country. And I wonder what you think of back when he was Secretary of State, John Kerry coming out and saying, if we would just stop publicizing the details of these terrorist attacks, maybe we wouldn't have so many.
Well, John Kerry is famous for blowing it in times when, to reporters and whatnot, and letting the cat out of the bag. I do recall there was, during the Iran, the nuclear talks a couple of years ago, he was in a cafe or something nearby taking a break, and a reporter managed to ask him a question about, do you foresee a resolution to the talks? And he said, Inshallah, which means if God wills it, in
Lord.
Arabic, if Allah wills it.
Good Lord.
So Kerry is not really known for being too bright, and he does let the cat out of the bag. But I think that that was a moment of truth from him, that the establishment would much prefer that the media did not cover these terrorist attacks, and when they do, when they're forced to, when they're big enough, then they manipulate the information, as you saw with the Fresno killing the other day, with the AP reporting that a guy who had said Allahu Akbar, actually said God is great, which is not what he said. So they do everything in their power to deflect off the reality and the causes of these attacks.
Right, and we did. And speaking of the Fresno attack, we had a small news company say in the Facebook post, that we have no idea why this happened. It's totally bizarre. No motive is identified. Suspect screamed Allahu Akbar. So that is the type of just rampant dishonesty we see. Now, I want to ask you, what do you make of the whole unholy alliance between Antifa, Femin, which from what I can tell is a very similar group, and ISIS? Because they all three seem to be hell-bent on derailing Le Pen, destroying Trump, destroying nationalist candidates all across the globe.
Definitely, and it seems that they're all working towards the same objective, like you said, which is basically overthrowing Western government, overthrowing Western society. I would imagine that if things were carried down the road far enough in their with all of their agendas, then that at least at that point they would then turn on each other. So it's basically a situation where right now they're working in collusion, favoring chaos, favoring violence. And they have the media on their side, and in a lot of cases they have the governments on their side as well. So it is quite a behemoth that has accumulated power right now, and it's definitely got a lot of momentum. But for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. I think that's what you're seeing now in Europe with the rise of the populist nationalists. They get called the far right. I think it's just a fringe that would be really the far right. I think it's just your average, like I said, your average citizen who wants to live in safety and has had enough now. So that people are being radicalized on both sides and standing up in ways that I don't think they would have in the past, because it didn't mean their survival.
Now, and here in a minute, we're going to have to get into what's going on in Poland, where you have an article that the Interior Minister of Poland said the bloody harvest of multiculturalism will not come to Poland. And of course, in Hungary, the Prime Minister said Europe must protect Christian civilization from the migrant flood. Before we do that, I want to ask you quickly, you've got Antifa and Femin, two groups rather that are very, for lack of a better word, progressive in their rhetoric. They say, we have to protect gay people from the horrible Mike Pence. We have to protect this minority, that minority. Women should be able to go out in public braless with no top on if they want to. And yet they have aligned themselves with ISIS, where, homosexuality is punishable by death in 11 Muslim nations that are now in large ISIS nations as well. What do you make? Why are these people going together? Are they just trying to destroy Western civilization? Is that it?
Definitely, and they all subscribe to different their own gods. Basically, the god of chaos for the anarchists, and the god of Islam being Allah, and so they have their own gods. But their goal, in many ways, is to attack Christian civilization. It's a very good versus evil kind of a war right now, in my opinion. And right now, it is more advantageous for evil forces to align themselves together, because strength in numbers, essentially. But they are a fractured group, whether they want to admit that or not. Like you said, the hypocrisy of LGBT rights, Antifa kind of gangs aligning themselves with the same people who would like to throw them off roofs is very, very bizarre. Although homosexuality is it's rampant in Islamic culture as well. I mean, you just do a little research on that. You can look at some of the testimony from soldiers that have been in Afghanistan. We had one, I believe it was a Green Beret, not too long ago, that ended up I think he was on the verge of being kicked out of the army because he took action against some of these very barbaric practices.
And
there.
In Afghanistan, I think they're called, and it's not as much, at least from the research I've done, even homosexuality as much as it is pedophilia against small boys. I know in Afghanistan they had what I believe were called T-boys, which were meant to service the higher-ups in the U.S.-backed Afghanistan army throughout the Bush and Obama years. Now, you mentioned it's a battle of good and evil, and I think the Prime Minister of Hungary, I believe it's pronounced Viktor Orban, would agree with you. He said said in the article you have up on Infowars.com, today we live in a time when international politics is a battlefield. The independence and freedom of European nations is at stake, and at the center of the battlefield is migration. The biggest debate in Europe today is about migration. This is what our future stands or falls on, the fate of Europe. The question is whether the character of European nations will be determined by the same spirit, civilization, culture, and mentality as our parents' and grandparents' time, or by something completely different. And when we come back, we've got to take another quick break. I want to get into what's going on both in Hungary, Poland, but in addition, what's going on in Europe and the world as a whole with this nationalist Christian uprising of people saying, hold on, this is too much, we need to step back, Western culture was good without these people. We'll be right back after the break. You're watching The Honest Media with Dan Lyman as our guest. He is foreign correspondent at Infowars.com. Welcome back to The Honest Media. I'm Tom Papper, and I am here again with Dan Lyman. He is foreign correspondent for Infowars.com. He's been writing a lot about what's happening in Europe with Le Pen, in Poland, in Hungary, elsewhere. And before the break, we were talking about what the Hungarian Prime Minister was saying, and I just want to ask you about... Or tell us, I guess, because our viewers may not know, how many Americans know what's going on in Hungary right now. Tell us a little bit about this prime minister and what his policies are.
Sure, definitely. I actually just spent some time in Hungary, and I'm headed back there next month in Budapest. And I was astounded at the environment of Budapest in general, the atmosphere there. It was so much calmer and more peaceful and safer in general than Western Europe, and I've spent quite a bit of time in Western Europe as well, and the environment there, it keeps you on edge at all times, and you don't really feel safe in general, especially if you're traveling with women or children, and it's just completely different in Eastern Europe due to the fact that Hungarian government took a stand early on against this influx of basically third world marauders and economic migrants pouring in from the Middle East and also in Africa. And they were getting hit pretty hard because they're essentially, they're on the front lines coming in from kind of that Syria region, coming in from the Mediterranean as well. And right away they figured things out and they said, we're not having any of this. They built kind of I wouldn't say temporary, but it was very hastily erected barbed wire kind of a fencing on the border with Croatia and Serbia, and now they're in the process of building what is being called quite a high-tech wall to support that as well. So they're going to have that double barrier, and they, along with a couple of other Eastern European countries such as Poland and the Czech, they're taking a stand against the European Union and saying we're not really going to play ball with this migrant game that you're trying to force upon us, and the European Union is responding with threats of legal action, and et cetera.
And of course, this is a quote directly from Orban, as in your article. It's a great article, and this is the kind of guy we're dealing with. For our viewers, you all know who George Soros is. You know what he does. You know what he sponsors, and this is from the Hungarian Prime Minister. Those calling themselves liberal and left-wing, who are supported with the money, power, and networks of international forces, with George Soros at the forefront, claim that taking action against migration is wrong, impractical, and moral. In contrast with this, we want to preserve the foundations of Europe. So it seems like these people really are, they're not playing ball with the globalism that is being forced down our throats. And of course, Poland is the same story. I know you probably haven't been to Poland as recently as you have Hungary, but tell us a little bit about what your article on Poland, Bloody Harvest of Multiculturalism Will Not Come to Poland, is about.
Right. So in Poland, you have a very similar government in power right now that is very similar to the Hungarian government. I believe the party is called the Law and Justice Party there. And they recently took over from the party was called the Civic Platform. They're basically globalist socialists headed by Donald Tusk, who is now the president of the European Council and is on the flip side, is applying pressure to Poland and Hungary and other nations like that to take their quota of migrants. So you have Poland cracking down now. They're saying they're not okay with it either. They're not going to play ball. before Tusk left office, he agreed with the European Union to take whatever the quota was for migrants, and Law and Justice Party came in and they killed that deal immediately. They said we're not playing ball with that. So I'll be in Poland in a few weeks to investigate the situation on the ground there as well.
And I have to ask, the European Union, I guess they have economic sanctions. They can commit economic warfare. They don't have a standing army. Their most powerful nations are people like Germany, who Angela Merkel is not what I think of when I think of powerful leader. What kind of consequences are they trying to bring upon Poland, upon Hungary, upon anybody who says, no, we don't want these migrants, they're causing problems?
Well, like you said, legal action and financial consequences are what they can attempt to bring. Like you also said, they don't necessarily have a standing army, although I do think that they're working towards that. Definitely seen some information on that they're trying to pull together a European standing army. But in reality, I don't know. I guess it's a lot of political capital. You have people like George Soros, who is Hungarian, actually. They'll put a lot of money behind protests, civil unrest, making things very difficult for these member states. But in reality, I think that it would be the smartest decision for all these countries to just make clean breaks with the European Union, the way that the United Kingdom is, and the biggest issue that they'll run into is unrest within their own countries from subversives that are like Antifa, that are being funded and encouraged by people like George Soros. So it's touchy when you're playing with an entire, society within your own country. But in reality, I think that if they were just to make these clean breaks and not allow for violent, revolutions within the country when they do, that would probably be the best decision. Rip it off like a Band-Aid.
Well, and of course, you mentioned these dissidents, these rioters, these disgusting human beings that we see in Berkeley. We're going to talk about what happened in Berkeley later on in this episode with Craig. It seems like these people, and I use that term very, very loosely, all they're doing is making the normal, everyday citizens of whatever country they're rioting in and acting like degenerate animals. All it's doing is pushing the moderates further to the right, because you're looking at these grotesque human beings in masks committing property crimes against public and private property, hurting people. That doesn't make you want to join their side. So do you think that what George Soros is doing is maybe a little bit counterproductive when it comes to these protests?
Absolutely.
Go on.
Absolutely. I wrote in 2015 an article. I believe that the left had overplayed their hand at that point, and they were in the process of tipping over the edge. The only thing they have now is violence and the censorship of free speech, which they're still very good at executing, because they do have tech giants on their side like Facebook and Twitter, who are very happy to censor mainstream voices of dissent against the narrative. But they also have, in a lot of cases, the governments are on their side, and the media is on their side. The media is very powerful in manipulating basically the thought process of the populace. But back to what I said, I think that the best thing that people can do is support their governments if they want to pull out of these big, super states like the European Union, like we kind of did here in we did there in the U.S. With Trump with TPP. That was kind of another union that was being pulled together against the will of the people. But I think that it's really an important time for people, especially people that are waffling in the middle and maybe don't know a lot about what's going on or don't want to be bothered with it. They need to be, because their future's at stake, and people need to get themselves educated on the issue, and definitely don't listen to the mainstream media, because they're all pushing the same exact agenda, which is coming out of the mouths of people like George Soros.
Absolutely. Now, Dan, we are running out of time. In a next minute, 2 minutes, give us a quick rundown of what's going on with the American media, because they're being, there's words that I would like to use that we can't use on television. They're being smacked down by American people every day. And you mentioned the left overplaying its hand. Give us a quick rundown of what's going on with the American media and the American people distrusting it and disgracing it in public.
Well, there's definitely just more and more folks are taking a stand and up against the media. From in this past week, I did an article came out yesterday. Just in the first few days of the week, the media was just suffering humiliating defeat after humiliating defeat. And the most recent one actually came last night. the New England Patriots had visited Donald Trump at the White House, and the New York Times published a misleading photo that tried to basically depict the crowd of Patriots and team affiliates at the White House as being much smaller than the one that visited President Obama back in 2015, I believe it was, and that was exposed as a lie by the Patriots themselves, who released other photos showing that the crowd was just as large, if not larger, this year. So they're just, every day they're getting slammed by children on CNN. Jim Acosta was trolled in the middle of a broadcast it turned out to be Kellyanne Conway's young son, preteen or young teen. He got into the shot and did kind of an X of rejection and said fake news at the screen. And there's all kinds of examples this week. It's been a good week for the American people.
And I think, if there happens to be any mainstream media people watching this right now, it's not likely, but if you come across it, there's a market for honesty. You may not believe it, but there's a market for honesty. Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining us. Really quick, give us your Facebook, Twitter, and where we can read your writings online.
Definitely. If you go on Infowars.com, I'm up there every day, and you go to the contributor section if you want to find me, Dan Lyman. And on Twitter and Facebook, I am Citizen Analyst.
And I believe on Facebook, you can also just search Dan Lyman. Well, thank you so much for joining us. You're watching The Honest Media. We will be back after these messages.